Hi, I'm Akhil Reed Amar, and I'm a professor at Yale Law School. I wrote the book as a sequel to a book called America's Constitution, a Biography. That book took the reader through the written Constitution, the preamble, Articles 1, 2, and 3, the legislature, the executive, the judiciary, Articles 4, 5, 6, and 7, the rest of the original Constitution, and then the amendments, beginning with the Bill of Rights, and then the Civil War amendments, and then the Progressive era amendments from the early 20th century, the mid-20th century amendments. It took a reader basically through the written text from start to finish. It's designed for a general audience, for someone in AP history or AP government, an undergraduate, or a law student or a law professor or a school teacher, someone just interested in civics. So that book came out in 2005. It was called America's Constitution, a Biography, but it was about the written Constitution. And it turns out that a lot in our constitutional experience isn't written down in so many words. The document doesn't say limited government, separation of powers, rule of law, checks and balances. It doesn't even say the Bill of Rights, even though there's a thing that we call the Bill of Rights. And when you read the Bill of Rights, it says Congress shall make no law abridging free speech or freedom of the press. It doesn't say anything about federal courts abridging free speech or the president abridging free speech. What about when a state abridges free speech? So this companion volume, America's Unwritten Constitution, the Precedents and Principles We Live By, is designed to supplement my original book on the written Constitution, because together the two books try to map out the entirety of the American constitutional experience. We have a written text, and it's supplemented. It's not supplanted, it's supplemented by what I'm calling the unwritten Constitution. And the big trick or the question is, how can you go beyond the written Constitution while still being faithful to it? In what ways would we have an unwritten Constitution that supplements, that fits, that completes the written Constitution and does not betray it? So my grandest hope is that, I'm trying to pull out my pocket Constitution here. I have many copies, but here's one of them. It's short. It's 8,000 words, including all the amendments. You could read it in less than an hour. But will you understand it in less than an hour? This book, this Constitution is not self-interpreting. It doesn't even tell us completely all the rules by which it should be construed. It doesn't come with its own instruction manual, so to speak. And my grandest hope is that a general interest reader, an ambitious high school student in AP history or AP government, a college undergraduate, a citizen wanting to know more about America, would read this book, America's Unwritten Constitution, maybe even would read the previous volume, America's Constitution, a Biography, and once having read those two books, she would be able actually not just to understand constitutional law, but to do constitutional law, to make constitutional arguments, to evaluate which constitutional arguments are good and which ones are bad and why. This thing was short so that ordinary people could read it, because they could decide 225 years ago whether they were for it or against it. And so it's not supposed to be like the tax code, which is this massive thing that isn't written for ordinary Americans. This thing was written for ordinary Americans, but my thought is that to really be able to use it, to be able to do constitutional law, you need to know a little more than just the 8,000 words. You need to know the tools and techniques of constitutional interpretation. And those aren't all written in this little thing called the written Constitution, but if you've read my book, you'll know the tools and techniques of constitutional interpretation. And you'll know that oftentimes the words are quite decisive, but not always. And you'll know ways of approaching the Constitution above and beyond mere literalism. I'm not sure I'm at Einstein's level of grand unifying theory yet. Maybe I'll never get there. But my big idea in one sentence is that we are all textualists and we are all living constitutionalists, so that conservatives as well as liberals believe in an unwritten constitution. They believe in federalism. They believe in limited government and checks and balances and separation of powers and the rule of law. And none of those words are in the Constitution. And yet conservatives talk about those things all the time. So at a general level, my thought is that this text is what we all have in common, but we also, in addition, all of us, liberals and conservatives, have in common ways of going beyond the text. All good constitutional thinkers talk about precedent, case law. We all are able to read the Constitution as a whole and not just clause by clause. If you read clause by clause, where, for example, does it say you can have a federal bank or an air force for that matter? It says armies and navies, but not an air force. Where does it say one person, one vote? So where does it say that a criminal defendant has a right to take the stand in his own defense, which it doesn't in so many words, and yet everyone today thinks that. The Ninth Amendment itself says that there are maybe unenumerated rights, that this document is too short to be able to list all the rights that Americans have. So the big idea, so in a nutshell, is that the text itself invites recourse to certain things that aren't specifically and explicitly itemized in the text. The text itself invites us to go beyond the text in certain ways. So that's as close to Einstein, I think, as I'm ever going to get. I think there's some interesting parallels to, for example, biblical interpretation. Some folks say, Martin Luther famously, sola scriptura, only the text, and yet he's interpreting the text from a certain point of view in order to put forth his understanding of the text. The text consists of words attributed to Jesus, and in some editions those are actually printed in red letters, but then there are the early church's understanding of the teachings of Jesus. They're the epistles of St. Paul. And then certain texts get put in the canon. We call that the Bible. Certain letters of St. Paul get put in the text, others perhaps not. And then there are the early church teachings and traditions and doctrines that emerge. And something similar happens in the Jewish tradition, the Torah and the Midrash, the interpretation, the Talmud, and then the interpretation of early texts. There's also something particularly interesting in the Christian tradition, because some of these texts were added later. And we Christians interpret earlier scriptures in light of later scriptures. We read the book of Isaiah through the lens of the life and ministry of Jesus. And so we read Isaiah in effect to say a virgin shall give birth rather than a young woman shall give birth. The Ten Commandments are reinterpreted, which are in the Old Testament, are reinterpreted by Jesus himself in his life and ministry and in his Gospels. In the same way, I suggest that we constitutional interpreters, read certain early texts in the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, for example, through the prism of the later 14th Amendment. When the 14th Amendment comes along, it causes us to read the earlier amendments in a different way, just as the Gospels cause us to read the book of Isaiah in a different way. These later texts don't rewrite the earlier ones in any way, but they add to them sequentially. The amendments are added to the constitutional text as just so many postscripts and post-postscripts. And I think there are some very interesting analogies between biblical interpretation and constitutional interpretation. My first big book on the Constitution is called The Bill of Rights, Creation and Reconstruction. And part one was creation, the original Bill of Rights, and part two was how that Bill of Rights should be reinterpreted, was reconstructed by the 14th Amendment after the Civil War. And so it's kind of Old Testament, New Testament.